Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We're mapping how far these buried stories travel, and I want to know if this particular account reaches you in daylight or in darkness, because what you're about to hear is the kind of history that feels different depending on when you encounter it. March 14th, 1849. Charleston, South Carolina. A city built on the backs of human bondage where fortunes rose and fell with the price of cotton and rice, and where certain families held power that seemed almost absolute. The Mercer family was one of these families. Jonathan Mercer, a shipping merchant whose wealth came from transporting goods and human cargo between Charleston and the Caribbean. His wife Victoria, 3 children, and a household staff of 14 enslaved people who maintained their 3-story mansion on Meeting Street, one of the finest addresses in the city. What makes the Mercer case so deeply disturbing is not how it began, but how long it continued. How many people saw, how many people knew, and how an entire community chose, day after day, to participate in something that should have been impossible. It started with a letter. March 14th, 1849. Mrs. Helen Ashford, Victoria Mercer's sister visiting from Savannah, wrote to her husband with growing alarm. She had arrived at the Mercer household 3 days earlier for what was meant to be a 2-week visit. The letter, discovered in 1923 in a trunk of family papers, describes what she found there. Something is terribly wrong in this house, she wrote. The servants move about their duties in complete silence. Not the usual quiet of well-trained household staff, but an absolute absence of sound. They do not speak to one another. They do not hum while they work. Yesterday, I dropped a teacup, and it shattered at the feet of the housemaid, a young woman named Clara. She did not react, did not look down, simply continued polishing the silver as if nothing had occurred. When I spoke to her directly, asked if she was well, she turned her face toward me, but her eyes seemed to look through me rather than at me. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Then she simply turned away and continued her work. Helen's letter grows more disturbed as it continues. The children's nurse, a woman named Patience, who has been with the family since Thomas was born, stands in the nursery for hours, swaying slightly, staring at the wall. The children seem frightened of her now, though they will not say why. The cook, whom I remember as a woman of substantial presence and strong opinions, now stands at the kitchen hearth like a statue, stirring pots with mechanical precision, her face completely blank. Jonathan insists that nothing is amiss, that I am imagining things, that the household runs as it always has. But Sister Victoria will not meet my eyes. When I pressed her on the matter, she became agitated and told me I must never speak of this again. She said some things are better left unquestioned, that the smooth operation of the household depends on not looking too closely. I do not know what she meant by this, and I am afraid to ask. The letter concludes with a request that her husband send a carriage for her immediately. I cannot remain in this house another night. There is something in the air here, something wrong that I cannot name. The servants move through the halls like shadows, like ghosts, and the family pretends not to notice. Helen Ashford left the Mercer household on March 16th. According to her subsequent correspondence, she never returned to Charleston. She never saw her sister again, and she never spoke publicly about what she witnessed in that house, though her private letters suggest it haunted her for the remainder of her life. But Helen was not the only one who noticed. March 20th, 1849. A delivery boy named Thomas Wright, who brought groceries from the market to the Mercer kitchen twice weekly, reported to his employer that something strange was happening at the Mercer house. According to testimony he would later give to a city investigator, the boy said he could no longer bear to make deliveries there. The colored folk in that house, sir, they ain't right. They move, but they don't move natural. And their eyes, when you look at them, there's nothing there. Like looking at a doll's eyes. And the smell, sir. There's a smell in that house now that wasn't there before. Like something's gone bad, but nobody's cleaning it up. When pressed about this smell, the boy became visibly distressed. It's strongest in the basement, sir. The door was open last time I delivered, and I saw down the stairs. Dark down there, but I heard sounds, like dripping, and I saw what looked like a table. A long table, with straps on it. The boy's employer, a grocer named William Haddock, initially dismissed these concerns as the imagination of a superstitious child. But Haddock himself noted in his business ledger, an entry discovered during research in 1967, that the Mercer account had become problematic. Mrs. Mercer's orders have become erratic. She orders foodstuffs in quantities either far too large or far too small for a household of their size. Last week she ordered 40 pounds of rice but no meat at all. This week, no vegetables but an unusual quantity of salt and lye soap. When I attempted to confirm the orders, she insisted they were correct and became angry when I questioned her. Payment is prompt, but the interactions have become increasingly strange. It was Reverend Samuel Whitfield who first brought the matter to official attention. Whitfield served as minister at St. Philip's Church, where the Mercer family held a prominent pew. On March 27, 1849, he wrote to the Charleston City Guard expressing concern about the Mercer household. The letter, preserved in the Charleston Municipal Archives, is careful in its wording, but the underlying alarm is evident. I write to you not with certainty but with deep concern. The Mercer family has not attended services for 3 consecutive Sundays, which is unlike them. More troubling are reports I have received from several parishioners who have attempted to call upon the family and been turned away at the door. The servants who answer the door, I am told, do so without speaking. They simply shake their heads and close the door again. Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Mercer's sister, has written to me expressing grave concerns about conditions in the household, though she will not specify the nature of these concerns in writing. I would normally not trouble the authorities with what might be merely a family's desire for privacy, but I have been approached by 3 separate individuals, all reliable members of this community, who have expressed to me a conviction that something is deeply wrong in that house. I ask that you might make inquiries. The city guard, in the person of Captain Marcus Dalton, did make inquiries. His report, dated April 2, 1849, describes a visit to the Mercer residence. Dalton and 1 deputy arrived at the mansion at 10 o'clock in the morning. They were greeted at the door by what Dalton described as a male servant of approximately 40 years, well dressed in house livery. Dalton noted that the servant did not speak, but gestured for them to wait in the entrance hall. After several minutes, Jonathan Mercer himself appeared. Dalton's report describes Mercer as cordial but clearly displeased by the intrusion. When Dalton explained that there had been concerns expressed about the welfare of the household, Mercer became indignant. He assured me that his household was in perfect order, that all servants were performing their duties satisfactorily, and that any rumors to the contrary were the product of idle gossip and malicious intent. When I requested to speak with Mrs. Mercer, he informed me that she was indisposed. When I asked to see the household staff to verify their well-being, as concerns had been raised about their condition, Mr. Mercer became quite cold. He informed me that his property, both human and material, was his own concern, and that I had no legal standing to inspect his household without evidence of a crime. This was, of course, entirely correct. In Charleston in 1849, the treatment of enslaved people was considered a private matter. Unless there was evidence of a crime committed against white persons or property, the authorities had no grounds to intervene in how a man managed his slaves. Dalton noted in his report, however, that during this exchange, he had observed 2 of the household servants moving through the hallway behind Mercer. I cannot adequately describe what struck me as unusual about their movement. They walked with a strange, shuffling gait. Their faces were visible to me only briefly, but I was struck by their expressions, or rather the absence of expression, blank, empty, as if no thought or feeling resided behind their eyes. Dalton concluded his report by stating that without evidence of criminal activity and with the master of the house insisting all was well, there were no grounds for further investigation. The matter was closed, but Dalton added a personal note at the bottom of his report, a note that would only be discovered decades later when these documents were examined by researchers. I left that house with a conviction that something terrible is happening within its walls. But I am bound by law and custom, and without the complaint of a white citizen, I am powerless to act. God forgive us for the things we choose not to see. April continued. The Mercer household remained closed to visitors. Deliveries were left at the service entrance. The family did not attend church. They did not appear at any social functions. According to records from the Charleston Library Society, Jonathan Mercer, who had been a regular patron, stopped visiting the reading rooms. His business associates began to note his absence from the usual venues where commercial matters were discussed and deals were made. It was a fire that finally forced open the doors of the Mercer house. April 19, 1849. A small blaze started in the kitchen, quickly contained but requiring the attendance of the city's fire brigade. What the firefighters witnessed inside that house would become the subject of testimony, investigation, and ultimately, a cover-up that would last for over a century. Fire Captain Robert Chen's official report describes the scene in carefully neutral language. Fire originated from unattended cooking pot. Damage minimal, contained a kitchen area, household staff present but oddly unresponsive to emergency. Required direct physical intervention to move several servants away from the fire area for their own safety. But Chen's private journal, donated to the Charleston Historical Society by his great-granddaughter in 1978, tells a very different story. The entry for April 19th is substantially longer than his official report. What I saw in that house will trouble me for the rest of my days. When we entered through the kitchen, we found a pot boiling over, flames licking up the wall. The cook, an older woman, stood 3 feet away, staring at the fire but making no move to extinguish it or call for help. When my men moved her away, she came without resistance, but also without any sign of awareness. Her eyes were open but seemed to see nothing. One of my men spoke directly to her, asking if anyone was hurt, and she did not respond. Did not even blink. We had to search the house to ensure no one else was in danger. What we found in the other rooms defies easy description. Servants standing motionless in hallways, sitting in chairs, staring at walls, moving through their tasks with a mechanical quality that seemed inhuman. In the parlor, a young housemaid was dusting the same table over and over, her hand moving in identical circles, never stopping. We watched her for a full minute, and she never varied the pattern. Never looked up, never acknowledged our presence. Chen's journal continues. Mr. Mercer appeared and was furious at our presence beyond the kitchen. He insisted we leave immediately. But I saw something as we departed that I cannot explain. Through an open doorway, I glimpsed down into the basement. There were candles burning down there, many candles, and I saw what appeared to be symbols painted on the floor, circles within circles. I saw a table that looked like an operating table with leather restraints. And I saw jars, rows of jars on shelves. The contents were unclear in the dim light, but something about them filled me with profound unease. When Mr. Mercer realized I had seen the basement, his face went white. He all but pushed us from the house. As we left, I looked back and saw Mrs. Mercer watching from an upstairs window. She was perfectly still, her hands pressed against the glass. Her expression was one of absolute terror. The fire captain's testimony was shared with Captain Dalton of the City Guard. On April 21st, Dalton returned to the Mercer house, this time with a magistrate's order to inspect the premises based on concerns for public safety following the fire. What they discovered in the basement of the Mercer mansion would never be officially recorded, but fragments of testimony exist in private letters and journals. From a letter written by Magistrate Henry Beaumont to his brother in Baltimore, dated April 25, 1849, discovered in 1956. I have seen something that has shaken my faith in human decency. In the basement of a respected merchant's home, we found what can only be described as a laboratory of horrors. Medical instruments, restraints, detailed journals documenting procedures I dare not describe in writing. And the servants, dear God, the servants. Whatever has been done to them has left them as hollow shells, capable of basic functions but stripped of will, of personality, of whatever spark it is that makes us human. The master of the house, when confronted, showed no remorse. He spoke of progress, of perfection, of creating the ideal servant class through scientific means. He showed us his journals as if we would be impressed by his methodology. He has been conducting experiments, medical procedures, attempting to isolate and remove what he called the defiant impulse from the human brain. The letter continues with details so disturbing that Beaumont's brother later burned most of the correspondence, preserving only fragments. What remains describes surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, drugs administered to induce compliance, psychological techniques designed to break and remake human personality. He kept records of everything. 14 subjects. Some died during the procedures. Those who survived were reduced to the automatons we now see moving through his house. He expressed frustration that he had not yet perfected his technique, that some subjects required multiple procedures, that the effects sometimes wore off and required what he called maintenance. Jonathan Mercer, it emerged, had become obsessed with the writings of certain European physicians who theorized about the physical locations of personality and will within the brain. He had obtained medical texts, surgical instruments, and various chemical compounds through his shipping connections, and he had decided to test these theories on his own household slaves. His stated goal, according to the journals seized from his basement, was to create perfectly obedient servants. Slaves who would work without complaint, without resistance, without even the capacity for rebellion. He believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize the entire institution of slavery. Victoria Mercer, his wife, had known. According to testimony she would later give, she had discovered what her husband was doing in early February 1849. His first successful procedure had been performed on their housemaid, Clara, in January. Victoria had confronted him, horrified, but Jonathan had convinced her that what he was doing was not cruel but merciful, that he was removing the capacity for suffering along with the capacity for resistance, that he was creating a more humane form of servitude. And Victoria, rather than expose her husband, had chosen to keep his secret, to help maintain the fiction that nothing was amiss, to turn away visitors and make excuses, because exposing him would destroy their family's reputation, their fortune, their place in Charleston society. Here is where the story becomes even more disturbing. Because once the authorities knew what Jonathan Mercer had done, they faced an impossible question. What now? To bring charges against Mercer would require a public trial. A public trial would require testimony about what he had done. Testimony that would expose the depths of cruelty that slavery enabled. That would force Charleston society to confront what was being done in their midst, in one of the finest houses on one of the best streets. It would generate newspaper coverage, not just locally but nationally. It would become ammunition for abolitionists in the North. It would, perhaps most importantly, threaten the very foundation of the slave economy by suggesting that the system was producing monsters. The decision was made at the highest levels. There would be no trial, no public charges, no newspaper coverage. Instead, Jonathan Mercer was given a choice. Immediate departure from Charleston with his family, never to return, or face unofficial but certain consequences. His property would be sold, his business dissolved, his name erased from society, and in exchange for this mercy, he would leave South Carolina within 1 week and never speak of his research again. On April 30th, 1849, the Mercer family departed Charleston by ship, bound for Brazil. According to manifest records, the family traveled with minimal luggage and no servants. They left behind a mansion full of furniture, business interests worth thousands, and 14 enslaved people whose minds had been irreparably damaged. The question of what to do with these 14 victims presented its own terrible dilemma. They could not be freed because they were not capable of independent survival. They could not be sold because their condition was obvious and would raise questions. They could not be kept together because the Mercer house needed to be emptied and sold quickly before questions arose. The solution was as practical as it was horrific. They were distributed among several different plantations, scattered across South Carolina and Georgia, their histories erased, their conditions attributed to natural mental deficiency rather than deliberate harm. But some people remembered. Some people kept records. A Quaker minister named Elias Worth, who had learned of the case through his work with the small free black community in Charleston, spent years tracking what had happened to Mercer's victims. His journal, preserved at the Library of Congress but rarely examined, documents his findings. Of the 14 people subjected to Mercer's procedures, 5 had died within weeks of being transferred to new locations. The remaining 9 survived, but their conditions varied. Some remained in the blank, unresponsive state that had so disturbed witnesses. Others showed partial recovery over time, regaining some capacity for speech and emotional response, but forever marked by what had been done to them. Worth interviewed several of them over the years. Though meaningful communication was difficult, one woman identified in his notes only as formerly of the Mercer household, now residing at the Ashton plantation near Columbia, was able to speak in broken sentences. Worth recorded her testimony in 1852, hurt inside head. He put things inside. Made it stop. Made everything stop. Can't remember before. Can't remember who I was. Sometimes I dream I was someone with a name that wasn't the name he gave. But then I wake and I'm not anyone. Just work. Just do what told. Can't not do what told, even when I want to. Can't want. Took away the wanting. Another survivor. A man who had been the Mercer's stable hand. Retained more of his faculties but described a similar experience. It like he reached inside my head and took something out. Took the part that says no. Took the part that feels, I know I should feel things. I know I should care about things. But it all flat now, like looking at the world through thick glass. I see it, but I can't touch it. Can't be touched by it. This man, whose name Worth recorded as Isaac, approximately 35 years of age, died by his own hand in 1854. His death was recorded in plantation records as the Negro Isaac, expired of natural causes. The Mercer Mansion on Meeting Street was sold in June 1849 to a family newly arrived from Virginia. According to Charleston land records, the house changed hands 7 more times over the next 30 years, an unusual turnover for a property of its quality and location. Each family that occupied it reported disturbances, servants refusing to work in certain rooms, particularly the basement. Reports of sounds at night, a persistent smell that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. By 1880, the house stood vacant. In 1887, it was demolished. The lot remained empty until 1903, when a commercial building was erected on the site. But the story doesn't end with the Mercers' departure or the demolition of their house. Because what Jonathan Mercer did in his basement, the experiments he conducted, the journals he kept, did not disappear with him, and the conspiracy of silence that protected Charleston's reputation had consequences that rippled forward through time in ways no one could have anticipated. Jonathan Mercer arrived in Brazil in June 1849 with his wife and 3 children. He settled in Rio de Janeiro, where slavery still flourished and where his wealth, though diminished, was sufficient to establish himself as a merchant. Brazilian records examined by researcher Dr. Patricia Almeida in 1989 show that Mercer purchased a small plantation outside the city within his first year. He purchased 12 slaves to work the property. And then, according to hospital records from 1851, something went wrong. A British doctor practicing in Rio de Janeiro, Dr. Thomas Whitmore, kept detailed case notes that were donated to the Royal College of Physicians in London after his death. Among these notes is an entry from March 1851 describing a patient brought to him by Brazilian authorities. Patient, male, approximately 45 years, presented in a state of extreme agitation and paranoia, claims he is being pursued by ghosts, by the slaves he killed, speaks in fragmented sentences about procedures gone wrong, about subjects who would not stay compliant, about a wife who poisoned herself rather than continue to keep his secrets. Upon examination, patient shows signs of advanced syphilis affecting the brain, which may account for delusional state. Patient also bears several recent injuries consistent with violent struggle, burns on hands and arms, deep scratches on face and neck. Patient claims these injuries were inflicted by spirits, by the dead returning to exact vengeance. Dr. Whitmore's notes continue over several days. Mercer, in his deteriorating mental state, spoke extensively about his work in Charleston, about the procedures he had perfected, about his plans to continue his research in Brazil, but also about complications, about subjects who had died on his table in Brazil because he had pushed too far, tried to refine his techniques, about the moment he realized his wife had understood what he truly was and chosen death over complicity. Victoria Mercer had died in November 1850, officially of yellow fever, but Jonathan in his delirium told a different story, said she had obtained laudanum, had taken it all at once, had left him a note that said only, "I cannot carry this anymore." Jonathan Mercer died in the Rio de Janeiro Charity Hospital on March 24, 1851, age 47. His children, now orphans in a foreign country, were taken in by the British consulate and eventually returned to distant relatives in England. According to records at the British National Archives, all 3 Mercer children died relatively young and none ever married or had children. The Mercer line ended with them, but Mercer's journals survived. The journals seized from his Charleston basement were never destroyed. They were instead locked away in the private files of several Charleston officials who had been involved in the cover-up. These men told themselves they were preserving evidence in case it was ever needed. But evidence of what? Evidence for whom? In a society where what Mercer had done to his slaves was illegal only in its extremity, not in its essence. In a city that had chosen silence over justice because justice would have cost too much. The journals passed from father to son, locked in safes and trunks, shameful secrets that families could not quite bring themselves to destroy. And in 1893, one of these journals found its way into the hands of Dr. Marcus Bellamy, a Charleston physician with interests in neurology and psychiatry. Bellamy read Mercer's meticulous notes with horrified fascination. The detailed descriptions of procedures, the careful documentation of results, the cold, clinical language describing the destruction of human personality as if it were no different than any other scientific experiment. Bellamy, to his eternal shame, saw not horror, but opportunity. In his own journal, portions of which were discovered in 1967, he wrote, "Mercer's methodology was crude, but his fundamental insights were sound. The human will, the capacity for resistance, these appear to reside in specific structures within the brain. If these could be modified with more precision, with better tools, with greater understanding of anatomy, imagine what might be achieved. Not the creation of automatons which serve no one, but the refinement of temperament. The elimination of the rebellious impulse while preserving the capacity for skilled labor." Dr. Bellamy never conducted experiments as extreme as Mercer's. He was more cautious, more subtle. But between 1893 and 1912, he treated dozens of slaves and later, after emancipation, black patients who came to his clinic seeking help for various ailments. And sometimes, when the opportunity presented itself, when a patient came to him with a head injury or a severe illness that required sedation, he would do a little more than was medically necessary. Would try small interventions, minor adjustments, all carefully documented in journals he kept locked away. The effects were subtler than Mercer's brutal surgeries. Patients who came to Dr. Bellamy with independent spirits might leave his care more compliant, more suggestible, more willing to accept their station in life. Bellamy told himself he was helping them adjust to a world that would not tolerate their resistance, making their lives easier by making them more acceptable to white society. He convinced himself that what he was doing was a mercy. Dr. Bellamy died in 1912, respected in Charleston medical circles, his darker work unknown. His journals were found by his son, also a physician, who was horrified by what he discovered. But rather than expose his father and destroy the family name, the younger Dr. Bellamy did what so many before him had done. He locked the journals away, added them to the growing collection of secret documents that recorded the true history of Charleston. The history that could not be spoken. The history that challenged comfortable narratives. It was not until 1948 that these documents began to surface. A fire at the home of a prominent Charleston family destroyed much of the house but revealed a locked safe in the basement, containing papers dating back to the 1840s. The papers included correspondence about the Mercer case, Captain Dalton's original notes, and portions of Mercer's journals. The family claimed they had no knowledge these documents existed in their home. The materials were transferred to the South Carolina State Archives with instructions that they be sealed for 50 years. But secrets have a way of slipping out. In 1952, a graduate student named Thomas Morrison, researching a dissertation on antebellum Charleston, stumbled across a reference to the sealed Mercer collection. He filed a formal request to access the materials, arguing they were essential to his research. His request was denied. When he persisted, pressure was applied. His dissertation advisor suggested he choose a different topic. When Morrison continued to push, he found himself unable to secure academic employment in South Carolina. He eventually left the state and abandoned his research. Morrison's experience was not unique. Over the next 2 decades, several researchers attempted to access the Mercer materials or to investigate the case through other sources. Each encountered obstacles, archives that were suddenly closed for reorganization, documents that could not be located, descendants of families involved who refused interviews or became hostile when questioned. It became clear that even a century after the events, powerful interests in Charleston wanted the Mercer story to remain buried. The archives were finally opened in 1998. According to the original 50-year seal, Dr. Jennifer Washington, a historian from Howard University specializing in the medical abuse of enslaved people, was among the first to examine the documents. Her resulting monograph, published in 2001, provides the most comprehensive account of the Mercer case to date. But even Dr. Washington's work encountered resistance. The University of South Carolina Press, which had initially accepted her manuscript, later withdrew their offer to publish. She eventually found a small academic press willing to take the project, but distribution was limited and the book received little mainstream attention. Why does this story matter? Why does it continue to be suppressed more than 150 years after the events took place? Dr. Washington argues in her work that the Mercer case represents something that American society, and particularly Southern society, still struggles to fully confront. Not just the horrors of slavery itself, which have been extensively documented, but the scientific and medical establishment's complicity in those horrors. The way respectable physicians and educated men could view human beings as experimental subjects. The way communities could know terrible things were happening and choose silence over action. The way institutions could actively work to suppress evidence of atrocities in order to preserve their reputations. The 14 people whose minds were destroyed in Jonathan Mercer's basement had names, had families, had lives and dreams and personalities before Mercer took all of that away, but we don't know most of their names. The records that might have told us were destroyed or lost. They exist in the historical record only as numbers, as subjects, as property damaged and disposed of. But here, on the sealed room, we believe that buried stories deserve to be told. That suppressed histories need to be brought into the light. Because forgetting serves only those who benefited from the original crimes. And silence, however comfortable, is its own form of complicity. We know some fragments about some of them. We know that one woman, called Patience in household records, was the children's nurse, that she had been with the family since the birth of their eldest son, Thomas, in 1826, that she was trusted enough to care for the Mercer children through their entire childhood, and that after Mercer's procedures, she could no longer recognize those same children, could only stand and sway and stare at walls. We know that the cook, a woman named Grace in fire department records, had previously worked for another family who sold her to the Mercers in 1845. That she was known for her skill with complicated French recipes, that she could read, an unusual and technically illegal skill for a slave in South Carolina, and that after Mercer was finished with her, she could barely remember how to boil water, could only stir pots in mechanical repetition, her mind no longer capable of the creativity that cooking requires. We know that Isaac, the stable hand who eventually took his own life, had been born free in Philadelphia, had been kidnapped at age 12 and sold into slavery, a tragedy that was disturbingly common, had spent his teenage years trying to escape, trying to get back to his mother in Philadelphia, and that Mercer's procedures finally accomplished what years of brutality had not. They made Isaac stop trying, took away his capacity to even imagine freedom, until years later enough of himself returned that he understood what had been taken from him, and decided that death was preferable to living as a shell. These were human beings. They loved people. They feared things. They hoped for things. They had favorite foods and songs they liked to hum and memories of their mothers and plans for their futures. And Jonathan Mercer, in his basement laboratory, destroyed all of that in pursuit of the perfect slave. The slave who could not resist, who could not rebel, who could not even imagine doing anything other than obeying. And Charleston, faced with the evidence of what one of their own had done, chose to protect themselves rather than seek justice. Chose reputation over truth. Chose silence over accountability. The full extent of what Jonathan Mercer did may never be known. His journals that were seized documented 14 victims in Charleston, but there are hints in the fragmentary records that survive that he had been experimenting for longer than anyone knew. That Charleston was not his first location. In 2003, Dr. Washington's research team uncovered ship manifests showing that Mercer had made 3 trips to Cuba between 1845 and 1847, ostensibly on business. Cuban plantation records from that period, partial and damaged by time, make reference to a North American merchant who purchased several slaves, kept them for periods of 3 to 6 months, and then returned them to sellers claiming they were defective. The plantation owners, according to one surviving letter, were disturbed by the condition in which these slaves were returned. They move and breathe and follow basic commands, one owner wrote, but they are no longer truly alive. It is as if their souls have been removed. If these references are indeed to Mercer, and the timing and description strongly suggest they are, then his experiments began earlier and claim more victims than the official record shows. The 14 people in Charleston may have been simply the ones he felt confident enough to keep. The ones where he believed he had perfected his technique. There's another disturbing thread that researchers have struggled to fully trace. Dr. Marcus Bellamy, The Charleston physician who discovered Mercer's journals in 1893 and conducted his own experiments was not working in isolation. His personal correspondence, portions of which surfaced in estate sales over the years, indicates he was part of a network of physicians interested in what they called the scientific management of the Negro problem. These doctors, scattered across the South in the decades after the Civil War, shared research and techniques. They met at medical conferences. They published papers in obscure journals, using coded language to discuss their work. A medical journal from 1897, The Southern Physician and Surgeon, contains an article by Bellamy titled On the Physiological Basis of Temperament in the African Race. The article, written in dry academic prose, discusses supposed differences in brain structure that Bellamy claimed explained behavioral differences between races. Buried in the technical language are references to observed cases where surgical or chemical intervention had produced marked improvements in eye tractability and work output. The article was cited by other physicians. It was discussed at conferences. It may have inspired others to conduct similar experiments. How many people were subjected to these procedures? How many had their minds and personalities destroyed in basements and clinic rooms across the South? We will never know. The records were kept private or destroyed. The victims could not speak for themselves, and the communities that might have demanded justice chose instead to look away. But there is one more piece of this story, one more thread that brings it forward into living memory. In 1961, a woman named Dorothy Simmons was interviewed as part of a federal writers' project documenting the last surviving people who had been born into slavery. Simmons was 104 years old at the time of the interview, living in a nursing home in Columbia, South Carolina. For most of the interview, she shared typical memories of plantation life, harsh but not unusual for the accounts of her generation. But at the end of the interview, seemingly as an afterthought, Simmons mentioned her mother. My mama, she was different from other folks. She could do her work, could cook and clean and do what she was told. But she didn't talk much, didn't talk at all really, and her eyes, they was empty like she was looking at you but not seeing you. The other slaves, they said she wasn't always like that. They said when she was young, before I was born, she was full of fire, full of life. But something happened to her, something that changed her. They didn't talk about what, said it was better not to speak of it. But I remember one old woman told me, said my mama had been in a bad place before she came to the plantation where I was born. Said there was a white man there who did terrible things, who broke people's minds like you'd break a horse. And my mama, she was one of the ones he broke. When the interviewer asked if Simmons knew where this place had been, she shook her head. Mama couldn't tell me. She couldn't remember. Couldn't remember her life before. Couldn't remember her own name from before. The name I knew her by, that was a name given to her after whatever happened to her. Sometimes she'd get this look, like she was trying to remember something important, like she was reaching for something just out of reach. And then the look would go away and she'd just go back to staring at nothing. Simmons' mother died in 1876, age approximately 50. She never regained her memories, never recovered what had been taken from her. Simmons said her mother was buried in an unmarked grave on the plantation where she had spent her final years. The plantation was later sold and subdivided. The slave cemetery was paved over in the 1920s when a road was built through the property. Could Simmons' mother have been one of Mercer's victims? The timeline fits. The description of her condition matches other accounts, but we cannot know with certainty. And that uncertainty, that inability to ever fully document the scope of the horror, is itself part of the legacy of what was done. The location where the Mercer Mansion once stood on Meeting Street in Charleston is now occupied by a modern office building. There is no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate what happened there. Most people who work in that building have no idea that they're walking over ground where human beings were strapped to tables and subjected to procedures designed to destroy their capacity for independent thought, where a respected merchant conducted experiments that would be considered crimes against humanity by any modern standard, where a community chose silence over justice. In 2018, a group of historians and activists in Charleston petitioned the city to install a historical marker at the site, explaining what had happened there. The petition was denied. The official reason given was that there was insufficient documentation to verify the events in question. But several members of the Historical Commission later admitted off the record, that the real reason was concern about the city's image, about tourism, about property values, about the potential for controversy. One commissioner, speaking anonymously to a local journalist, said, "We can't memorialize every terrible thing that happened during slavery. If we started putting up markers for every atrocity, every abuse, every horror, the city would be covered in them. At some point we have to move forward. We have to focus on the positive aspects of Charleston's history. But whose history are we protecting when we choose not to remember? Whose comfort are we preserving when we decide that some truths are too disturbing to acknowledge? The people who worked in the Mercer household, who had their minds destroyed, who lost their very selves to one man's obsession with creating the perfect slave, they don't get the option to move forward. They don't get the choice to focus on the positive. Their suffering doesn't become less real because we find it uncomfortable to acknowledge." Dr. Jennifer Washington, in the conclusion to her monograph on the Mercer case, writes, "The conspiracy of silence that protected Jonathan Mercer and buried his crimes for over a century is not a relic of the past. It is an active choice made again and again, every time we decide that the comfort of the present is more important than the truth of the past. Every time we choose not to install a marker, not to teach the full story, not to confront what our ancestors did and what our institutions covered up. Silence is not neutral. Silence is not passive. Silence is a choice, and it is a choice that serves those who benefited from the original crimes. The Mercer case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we memorialize suffering that was deliberately erased from the record? How do we honor victims whose names we don't even know? How do we hold institutions accountable for cover-ups that happened generations ago, but whose effects still ripple through the present? And perhaps most difficult, how do we acknowledge that the impulse that led Charleston to choose silence over justice in 1849, the impulse to protect reputation, to avoid uncomfortable truths, to prioritize the feelings of the powerful over the suffering of the powerless, is an impulse that still exists today? This isn't just a story about something that happened 175 years ago. It's a story about how we choose to remember, about what we decide matters, about whose suffering we acknowledge and whose we prefer to forget. Every time a petition to memorialize the victims of slavery is denied because it might hurt tourism, every time a historical marker is rejected because it might make people uncomfortable, every time someone says, "We need to move on," or "That was a long time ago," we are making the same choice Charleston made in 1849. The choice to protect ourselves rather than honor the dead. The choice to preserve our comfort rather than confront the truth. The 14 people who were destroyed in Jonathan Mercer's basement deserve more than silence. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their suffering acknowledged. They deserve for us to say their names, even when we don't know what those names were. Because forgetting them, choosing not to see what was done to them, is the final violence, the one that erases them completely, as if they never existed at all. If you've stayed with this story until the end, if you've listened to this entire account, then you now carry this knowledge. You now have a choice about what to do with it. You can share it. You can talk about it. You can ask why there's no marker in Charleston commemorating these victims. You can refuse to participate in the silence. Or you can close this video and move on. Let it fade from your mind. Add it to the list of terrible things you've heard about, but don't quite want to think about too deeply. And that too is a choice. One that countless people have made before you. One that allows the comfortable fiction to continue. One that prioritizes our own comfort over the memory of those who suffered. I want you to think about something. Right now, wherever you are, whatever time it is as you're hearing these words, there are 14 people who existed, who lived and loved and hoped and dreamed, whose entire identities were destroyed by a man who faced no consequences, who were scattered and erased and forgotten. And for over 150 years, that forgetting was deliberate, was protected, was enforced by people who decided that silence was preferable to truth. You can't undo what was done to them. You can't bring them justice. They're long dead, buried in unmarked graves or graves that were paved over or lost to time. But you can refuse to participate in the forgetting. You can refuse to let their suffering be erased. You can bear witness, even this late, even knowing we'll never know most of their names. You can say, "This happened. This was real. These were human beings, and what was done to them was an atrocity." And the fact that a community chose to cover it up rather than seek justice is itself an atrocity that we should name and acknowledge. That's all we can do for them now. Remember, speak the truth. Refuse the comfortable silence. It's not much. It's far less than they deserved. But it's something. And sometimes, bearing witness is the only justice left to give. The sun sets on Charleston the same way it did in 1849. The city is beautiful, filled with history and architecture and stories of the past carefully curated for tourists. But underneath that beauty, in the basements and the soil and the forgotten corners, there are other stories, darker stories. Stories of suffering and silence and collective decisions to look away. Stories that whisper to us if we're willing to listen. Stories that demand we ask ourselves, what are we choosing not to see right now? What truths are we finding too uncomfortable to acknowledge? Whose suffering are we deciding doesn't matter enough to interrupt our comfort? These are the questions the Mercer case leaves us with, not just about the past, but about the present. About who we are and who we choose to be when confronted with truths that threaten our sense of order. About whether we have the courage to see what's in front of us, even when seeing it demands something from us, even when it costs us something, even when the comfortable lie is so much easier than the unbearable truth. Jonathan Mercer died delusional in a foreign country, haunted by the ghosts of those he destroyed. The 14 victims whose minds he shattered died in unmarked graves, their suffering unacknowledged, their names forgotten. The community that covered up his crimes went on with their lives, comfortable in their silence. And generations later, we're still making the same choices, still deciding that some truths are too disturbing to face, still choosing comfort over justice, still participating, actively or passively, in the erasure of those whose suffering we find too inconvenient to remember. But you know now. You've heard this story. You can't unhear it. And what you do with that knowledge, whether you share it or forget it, whether you let it change how you think about history and memory and justice, or whether you let it fade like so many uncomfortable truths before it, that choice is yours. Just know that it is a choice. And that silence, as always, serves someone. The question is, who are you choosing to serve?